Constituency. Wow.
All right, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Morning. Okay, Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, it's February 8th, 2024. And today we've got some housekeeping we have to do, but majority of the time will be spent on following the wake rule. Before we get started, let's do introductions. We'll start to my left.
Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel.
Representative Seth Bongartz, Arlington, Manchester, Sandgate, Butterfly.
Representative Carol Odie from, and I represent the New North End of the Far New North.
I'm Representative Mark Higley, and I represent the Orleans Lamoille District.
Good morning, Senator Dave Weeks, representing Rutland County.
Jenny Lyons, Senator, representing Chittenden Southeast.
Chris Spray, representing Tennessee.
Senator Mark McDonald, representing almost all of Orange County. Good morning, Representative Trevor Squirrel, and I represent Underhill and Jericho. And back here is, okay. First up, there were the minutes from February 1st, 2024. Senator Bray.
Chair, I move approval of the minutes of February 1st, 2024.
We have a motion for approval of the minutes of February 1. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all's in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. All right. So first up, we're back to the Rule 23 P17, which is the Agency of Natural Resources Use of Public Waters rules. We received some new documentation and verbiage from the department earlier this week, so I'll ask them to speak to that first. We may have a little conversation around that and what's contained therein, and then we'll allow the folks that are on the list on the agenda to provide testimony, and then the committee can ask questions. And I certainly want to thank the committee for their indulgence at the last meeting for withholding questions so we could get through as much testimony as possible, discussion, and then decide how we want to move forward on the rule. So we'll start with the department, if you want to join us up here. Here.
Good morning.
I'm sorry, introduce yourselves. And
Good morning, senators, representatives. We'll do our introductions again.
Hi, I'm Laura DeLugalecki, and I'm with the Department of Environmental Conservation in the Lakes and Ponds Program.
Caitlin Ellerman, and I'm an attorney with the Agency of Natural Resources, working with the Lakes and Ponds Program.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm Jason Batchelder. I'm the DEC Commissioner.
if you want
Sure. So as
to speak to what you submitted to us, it's different than what we have.
So as the committee is aware, last week, the Responsible Wakes for Vermont Lakes Representative Meg Handler submitted testimony, including written testimony that requested the agency to address 2 items in the final rulemaking, and those included the definition of wake boat at section 56.16, as well as the topic of normal use as addressed in the final rulemaking package. So the Agency of Natural Resources prepared a description of edits that was submitted to the committee on Monday. I believe that was February 5th. And that has been posted on the committee's webpage. It was posted on the agency's webpage yesterday. I believe it was a little late, but it is up there currently as the description of changes for February 8th Lcar. The agency is amenable to the addition of language to the definition of wake boat, and also suggested incorporating similar language into the definition of wake sport. So there is now reference to design features of a motorboat that would be used to increase the size of a wake. And you'll see basically or design features added to those two definitions. Are there any questions about that?
Again, Mr. Chair, so basically what that design feature is, it's saying that there's almost any boat out there could possibly have a design feature that could create a wake that would be considered a wake boat now.
That would purposefully increase the size of the wake. Yes. As noted in the memo, Laura was able to consult with one member of the wake boat user group to identify any concerns with this. It sounds like it's unlikely to be an actual issue or feature that is a sort of a standalone wake enhancing feature. It's most likely going to still be combined with the other sorts of features that are listed in that definition, such as weighting, ballast tanks, bags, that sort of component that is really necessary to actually increase the size of the wake.
Thank you.
We do encourage, especially given the late timing of this suggestion, despite this language having gone through the entire formal rulemaking process, that there at least be opportunity to have any additional comment on the topic.
We're good right now?
Again, so you're saying additional comment, but are you looking for additional comment from wake boat owners as well, or folks that may be able to transform their boats into wake boats?
Sure. So the suggestion would be that if there was anyone that was seeking to put comment to the committee, that assume that would be welcomed by the committee.
Yeah, I think that's a fair.
How is that going to work though, Mr. Chair, for take a vote today?
If the majority of the committee wants to give the public an opportunity to comment, then we can also postpone action on this rule until next week. That would be possible.
Yeah, the 45-day review period is up on February 17th. So you have one more meeting that you can take this up without needing to get an extension.
Well, if that's a possibility, Mr. Chair, I'd like to suggest that, and I don't know if it's appropriate now, but make a motion to postpone because I think it's important. I mean, it sounds like you talked to maybe one wake boat individual and or a person who might have a boat that they could transform into this for this process. So I think it would be important. I've been reached out to by wake boat owners, and I'd like to maybe touch base as well. I haven't heard about it.
No, that's fine. That's fair. Senator Bray.
If we're considering postponing, and I understand the reasons that you're talking about, considering it, I have a question for A&R, and that is, if we were to postpone another week, would that have implications for enacting a rule that would be effective this voting season?
It should not, although we are hopeful that the committee does approve the rule to move forward. We would love to have it approved today. We understand that in order to meaningfully allow the opportunity for further comment, that would have to extend. But yes, either way.
This committee is sensitive to the timeline. I suspect a week shouldn't upset that timeline. But I appreciate the concern.
If we were to vote to send this back for further consideration by A&R of the number of feet for the setback for the rule, then would they have enough time to implement, to have us extend this another week and then to come back with another number of feet?
I can't answer that question. Ledge Council.
I can't answer that question, but I can say that from a procedural process perspective, under the APA, you don't have the ability to send them back and say, look into this again. You could raise the concern, you could object. If you object, they then have 14 days to respond. And then after that 14 days, they could move forward with adoption, even if Lcar certified the objection. So objecting is what Lcar has as a procedural tool to get the agency to need to provide a response as to why they don't agree with the objection. And if the objection was along the lines of inconsistent with legislative intent on the feet, or statutory authority on the feet, or arbitrary on the feet, then that would be something that would require a majority vote of the committee for the objection. And then it's the two-part. You'll remember from the forbearing species rule, for example, there were the votes to object and then the votes to certify the objection.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Higley?
Is this up for debate, Mr. Chair? Again, if this is the case,
There's no motion on the table right now.
So I would not approve of that. I think by the information that we've received in here, the agency has signaled any due diligence, considered that through testimony. And this is their recommendation. And I would hate to, throw this back again, as we have in the past for some things and had things continue to go on and on. Just my opinion.
Well taken. I'd like the department to finish their presentation. And I also want to make sure that we give the witnesses an opportunity to present. They're kind enough to come back again this week after not being able to do it next week. So I would ask that discussion and debate happen after. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll try to go through this relatively swiftly. The second item that was raised in Meg Handler's testimony related to the agency's consideration of wake boats as a normal use or not. And it appeared, as described in our written filing, that there was uncertainty based on a response to comment number 25, as well as a change to the APA filing forms that removed reference to wake boats as not a normal use. And we have suggested to address this by clarifying in the record, essentially through a revised response to comment 25, that the agency did not undertake an evaluation of whether wake boats fell into the definition of normal use, which is defined at section 3.5 as those uses that did not occur on a specific public water body, or those uses that did occur on a specific public water body on a regular, frequent, and consistent basis as of January 1, 1993. So there is, again, in the written filing, language showing what the agency will clarify, that the agency did not address whether or not wake sports are a normal use under section 5.6, as this was not necessary to support the proposed rule. And we clarified or responded to the comment that asserted that anything that was not a normal use or is not a normal use was banned or prohibited. That is not a mandated component under the rule language. There is the option to regulate really any use, and adequately protecting normal uses is a provision of the use of public waters rules, as is language regarding providing for. So I'll stop there. That's the language is in our filing. One additional aspect that I would point out is language within the rules that directs the agency to provide for all normal uses to the greatest extent possible. That language is found in section 2.6. And then it also makes reference to section 2.2, the criteria that the agency uses to evaluate the variety of uses.
There's been a lot of conversation around this concept and idea of normal use. And what the implications of it showing up in some places and whether it's evidentiary and moving forward, and sort of the interpretation of the agency's ability to do certain types of things with this rulemaking. So we have Ledge Counsel here, Michael O'Grady, and we've had some conversations about this, and he's much smarter than I am. Okay, so I would ask him to maybe speak to this issue and sort of along the lines of what we communicated, and then maybe you can take questions as needed. Thank you, Mike.
This is Mike O'Grady, Legislative Counsel. So remember, Lcar's review is limited. It's limited to looking at whether the rule complies with statutory authority, complies with legislative intent, it's arbitrary and capricious. Anthea can fill out the other 3 or 4. When you look at the statute and 10 VSA 1424 in that entire chapter, there's only one use of the term normal use. And it provides, second. It says, to the extent possible, the secretary shall provide for all normal uses. It doesn't say that non-normal uses are prohibited. It doesn't define what a normal use is, etc. In addition, there is no authority for Lcar to object to a rule based on the public comment. Frankly, public comment is just an instructional tool to respond to the input from the public during the APA public comment period. And the fact that the agency might have erred in their response to one comment, I can guarantee you that the agency has erred in response to many comments over the years. It's never been the basis of an Lcar objection. Now, maybe you say that their comment and their revision of it somehow indicates that the rule is arbitrary. But remember, this committee and the legislature defined what is arbitrary for the purposes of the APA and Lcar review a couple of years ago. And there are 3 standards in there. And I will address those standards. So arbitrary means that there is no factual basis for the decision made by the agency. The decision being allowing some use of wake boats on some lakes. If you look at the scientific information statement provided by the agency, it's probably the best scientific information statement I've ever seen the agency provide. Maybe people disagree with that, but there is a factual basis as indicated in their scientific information statement. And then the decision made by the agency is not rationally connected to the factual basis asserted for the decision. I mean, that's largely explained in the scientific information statement and in the response to comments. And then last, the decision made by the agency would not make sense to a reasonable person. We've already heard testimony from witnesses who have supported the rule and said it makes sense to them. So it makes sense to a reasonable person if you assume that the people that are testifying in front of you are reasonable. So I don't see how it meets the test for arbitrariness. That's a decision for you all to make. And I just want to say that the statute does not require a use of any of the surface waters to be normal uses. I mean, stand-up paddleboarding was not a normal use in 1993. And by the way, the designation of 1993, that is made in rule. That is not a statutory designation. So if you're going to say that it has to have been a normal use prior to 1993, you're probably going to eliminate a lot of like the personal watercraft, because those craft that carry like 3 to 4 people, they were not a normal use in 1993. Stand-up paddleboarding, yeah, it was invented by like the Hawaiians, like the BCs, but it wasn't a common use probably until the early 2000s or mid 2000s. I mean, if you're going to say that it had to have been in existence in 1993 and common, I think you're going to have an issue with other uses as well.
Thank you, Michael. Any questions for Mike? Thank you. I think we'll start on the folks that are here to provide testimony. We'll start with Steve Cease, and then Phil Dodd will be up after that.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Anywhere? Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee members, and thanks for taking so much time on this really interesting and controversial subject. I'm a little, well, I guess the word is taken aback by some of the new information. Perhaps taken aback is not the right word, but I'm surprised, and I may try to divert from what I had prepared to say in response to some of the things that the DEC and Mike O'Grady have told you. Fundamentally, I personally, at least, would like to have more opportunity to review the proposal by the agency concerning normal use. I understand Mike O'Grady's comments, but I do think that normal use is one of the pivotal concepts in the statutes that we're dealing with. And I would like to take a little more time, perhaps certainly by next week, to review what the DEC is saying and perhaps offer further comment. The other point that Mr. O'Grady made was very interesting. His assertion or his outline of the reasons for your review and potential rejection of a rule. And I'd like to speak to some of those points he made. He emphasized the scientific nature of the DEC's approach, and I have no issue with that for today's for my comments this morning. I want to talk about safety, and with regard to safety, I believe and I want to assert that the agency has no factual basis for its approach to safety. And in fact, my fundamental point for you today is that with regard to swimmer and kayak and paddleboard and canoeing use, no rule is about the same as a rule. Or put it the other way, this proposed rule does not change the situation with regard to boater safety as it's outlined in present statute at all. So for me, that is a fundamental reason for you to reject the rule and perhaps suggest to the agency and Department of Environmental Conservation that they go back and take a substantive look at the question of safety. Now, I'm 55, I'm 77 years old. I've been paddling for probably 55 years in kayaks and canoes of all sorts, from racing boats to conventional canoes. And I have been really taken aback by the DEC's approach that for some reason they will allow or they wish to see a 500-foot setback for shoreline protection, but they only rely on the existing statute, which I think is 23 VSA 3311, which says that with regard to speed, a boat must not operate within 200 feet of a swimmer or boater at more than 5 miles an hour. How can the agency possibly distinguish 500 feet for shoreline protection, but only rely on a mere 200 feet
If I may,
swimmers?
if you weren't here last week, we're trying to keep testimony to around 2 minutes. And you're already beyond that. And I didn't tell you that ahead of time. And I don't know that you were here last week, but I just want to remind folks, want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
If you'll try to bring those comments.
I had some written comments I thought would come in at 2 minutes, but I had diverted because of the new information.
I'll give
Thanks,
you
Mr.
a second.
I'll try to wrap up. I think that rejection of the proposed rule with regard to safety is the committee's only reasonable course of action at this point. I think the real answer in my mind and is a legislative ban on wake boats. And that's my fundamental position as a paddler of more than 55 years. Let me just say, a 5-foot wave is going to sink me in any canoe or kayak that I own. And the succeeding wave chain, even with progressively smaller waves, also presents a significant danger to me, and I think to many of my fellow paddlers out there. So I would ask you to reject the rule, comment to the agency that safety has not been substantively addressed. And in closing, just remember, if you don't adopt the rule, it's the same as adopting the rule. If you adopt the rule, you are actually, I believe, tending to endanger the traditional practices of all Vermonters as we've paddled and swum on Vermont lakes for generations. So thanks for your time, and I'm sorry to run over.
Phil Dodd and then John Dillon.
Morning, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Phil Dodd. I do not own lakefront property, but I do swim, kayak, and sail on Vermont's inland lakes. I agree with the 82.5% of the people who spoke at DEC's hearings on this rule. Wake boats and the abnormally large waves they generate are bad for our Vermont lakes and require regulation greater than the proposed 500-foot rule. In my view, the committee should object to the rule and request the agency amend it because it meets 2 of the criteria in 10 VSA Section 842 for objecting to a rule. The proposed rule is contrary to the intent of the legislature, and the proposed rule is arbitrary. First, let me address the intent issue. A different section of Title 10, Section 1421, provides policy guidance for the use of public water rules. It says that the rules should promote safety, and later states that, among other things, the purpose of the rules shall be to further the maintenance of safe and healthful conditions. Huge rogue waves are potentially dangerous for many lake users, including swimmers, paddlers, and fishermen. Despite many people raising safety issues, the agency never really addressed these concerns. This is contrary to the intent of the legislature as expressed in statute and provides one basis for objecting to the rule. The second problem with the proposed rule is it considers, well, we learned today, I was going to say normal use. Now they're saying they don't know if it's a normal use. Normal use is defined, as we know, as any lawful use of any specific body of water, public water, that occurred on a regular, frequent, and consistent basis prior to January 1st, 1993. Wake boats do not meet this definition. Considering wake boats to be a normal use would not make sense to a reasonable person and is thus arbitrary. I take a different view than Mr. O'Grady. When I look at the use of public waters rule, it states, use conflict shall be managed in a manner that provides for all normal uses to the greatest extent possible. So I don't think it's a question of whether, it's not that a non-normal use can't be allowed. It can be, as long as there's not a use conflict. But when there is a use conflict, as there clearly is with these wake boats, you've got to manage these things to the greatest, so that we can enjoy the traditional uses to the greatest extent possible. So that's really a big issue for me. In fact, the agency acknowledged that it has the power to prohibit anything that does not qualify as a normal use when it is necessary to adequately protect the normal use. And I think it should be doing that here. So I would ask you, please send this rule back to address public safety and consider whether a ban or stricter regulation is necessary to protect normal uses.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have John Dillon, then Chip Stone.
Hi, everybody. John Dillon, Middlesex, Vermont. I thought you might vote today on this rule, and I know your rule is very narrow. You can approve it or not under 7 reasons. I urge you to vote no because I've got 4 reasons to reject it. Number 1, it violates legislative intent. Title 10 VSA Section 1421 says the state's role as trustee of its navigable waters is to promote public health and safety. Hundreds of people testified over the last year about the safety impact of wake boats. There are stories of property damage, little kids getting swamped. The DEC admits it has no expertise in safety and would have to hire a consultant to help with safety planning. That's an abdication of responsibility. It also violates legislative intent that places safety and public protection paramount. Arbitrary. Number 2, The DEC takes a pass on critical safety enforcement issues. They think citizens will enforce this rule. Somehow citizens with magic eyes that can tell, 450 from 500 feet. By failing to address safety and enforcement, ANR has promulgated an arbitrary rule. 3, failure to maximize public input. When the agency, this is the normal thing again, when the agency released the rule last June, it declared wake boats are not a normal use. Makes sense. They generate 5-foot waves. That's not normal on any pond. 6 months later, filed with you, the agency said they were a normal use. That's both an obvious arbitrary change. They also failed to get public input, maximize public input. How can you publicly comment on a big change if you don't know what it is? 4, failure to address the substantial environmental impact. In this September memo, this agency staff recommended a tougher rule. The agency secretary rejected that, but the agency staff cited the precautionary principle. Wake boats will get more powerful. We'll soon see more than one on a lake at a time, churning even more phosphorus into our waters. This rule fails the environmental protection test because it will worsen our phosphorus pollution. Thank you.
Thank you. Chip Stone and Rodney Putman.
Good morning. I'm Chip Stone from East Montpelier. From my perspective, this rule protects a brand new water sport practiced by a few at the expense of the thousands of us who paddle, swim, fish, and ski. The Scott administration's material reengineering of the unanimous DEC proposal will do more harm than good. Granted, it will protect a bunch of our smaller ponds and lakes, but it leaves most of Vermont's inland waters vulnerable to an inadequate, flawed, and unenforceable rule. A few of the issues. 1, this rule allows wake boats on our ponds and lakes where jet skis are prohibited. What possible reason could be for that? There isn't one. It's arbitrary. It's even irrational. 2, this rule deviously, in my view, adds a normal use definition, wake boats. Why? The only conceivable reason to me is that it facilitates the administration's plan to deny the petitions to ban that many lake organizations are drawing up as we speak. And 3, and most importantly, this rule sets that 500-foot setback from shorelines, which ANR reduced from DEC's unanimous 600-foot recommendation, but only 200 feet from swimmers, paddlers, anglers, and skiers. No one in their right mind could say that an ocean-sized wave generated 200 feet from your grandchild in a kayak is safe. The safety of thousands of us who paddle, ski, swim, and fish is completely ignored with this rule. It's not just arbitrary, it's actually dangerous and totally irresponsible. What should you do? I think this rule should be denied. ANR will probably implement it anyway, and legislation started to limit wake boats to lakes larger than 2,000 acres. This will allow ample open water space for wake boats to enjoy their activity and at the same time protect the rights of the thousands of us truly normal users. And even add a provision allowing lake organizations with a majority votes to petition ANR to allow wake boats, real democracy. Responsible Wakes for Vermont Lakes has done yeoman's work with their petition. This rule essentially eviscerates that work. It's now a rule that favors the very few over the many. It's a bad rule, and I would not want my fingerprints on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dorothy Todd. And then it's Colby Switzer after that.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Todd. I'm 82, and I live on the banks of the Mad River in Warren Village, and I was badly flooded in 1998. I am now 25 years flood resilient, and I attribute this resilience to taking up kayaking, embracing the water rather than fearing it. Over the years, I've enjoyed paddling in 13 of the 30 lakes currently listed as permitted for wake boats, many of them many times. Lake Iroquois, Peachum Pond, Molly's Falls Pond, Joe's Pond, Great Averill Pond, Island Pond, Caspian Lake, Waterbury Reservoir, Lake Dunmore, Lake Carmi, Lake Willoughby, Seymour Lake, and Lake Fairleigh. I would like to thank all the lake and watershed volunteers that devote countless hours to preserving these precious waters. And I would also like to thank ANR's Fish and Wildlife for providing Vermont public access boat launch sites. Going forward, I would be glad to contribute to this effort by paying kayak licensing fees. I'm a pretty good kayaker and I can read the wind and waves and currents and I can still roll my boat, but I'm not at all sure how well my roll would hold up if caught unexpectedly in the cross current set in motion by 2 or more wake boats. I also find the noise and the dangerous water disturbances created by the wake boats totally antithetical to the whole reason I got into kayaking in the first place. My vote is to ban them completely. Also, as an open water swimmer, I find myself unable to tolerate swimming in water where even a regular motorboat has just passed. I gag on the gasoline residue and feel for all the creatures that must live in the midst of such toxins. The wake boats are our fuel dealers' gold mine. The banning of all wake boats on Vermont lakes is equivalent to banning billboards on Vermont highways. Thank you.
Thank you. Colby? And Tyler Keith? Okay. Right now, I'd like to open it up for questions from committee members and any discussion you'd like to have. I would like to leave a few minutes at the end of the meeting before 9 o'clock in order to, we have an extension, I think, from let's see if it needs-
School board.
The school board. And then we have a letters to committees of jurisdiction regarding the PCB. Right. Okay. So I open up the floor to committees if they have questions. Senator Lyons.
So, as you were developing the rule, did you consider the cumulative effect both of multiple boats at one time, of the wake boats at one time, but also the accumulation of effect along shorelines and islands as a result of wake boat waves?
Sure. In the studies that we reviewed, again, we were looking at a small subset. They did incorporate cumulative effects of multiple wake boats. A lot of the studies were looking at one pass of one or just a few boats. Very few of them were focused on major cumulative effects.
Are there any sort of longitudinal studies about what happens over time with the repeated use of wake boats?
I think they all touch on that. I mean, I think that the studies that really delve into the wave power talk about the intensity of the wave over time and the erosive effects that they can have. So, I think increased wave power over time, certainly leads to additional shoreline erosion.
And just considering, did you consider that in the development of the rule? I mean, if you compound that with the climate changes that we're seeing in the hundreds of storms that will produce more waves, is that a consideration?
No, I mean, we were really focusing on finding a wake sport zone that would be protective of wave energy by the time it hit the shoreline, that it would dissipate enough to mimic kind of the background of waves from wind or just natural, accustomed recreation that's already there. So, yeah.
So, and then I know that there are rules around the filling of the tank and then the emptying of the tanks. And failing to remember, is there anything in there that requires sort of a Clorox cleaning to ensure that nothing is left in the tanks for contamination?
For decontamination, when a wake boat were to travel between different lakes, they're required to provide some sort of evidence that they've been decontaminated at a decontamination site, which typically uses hot water heated to a certain temperature that has been shown to kill, any kind of invasive or potential invasive species.
How many of those sites exist now?
Well, so this is part of the implementation that we are not, this is not fully fleshed out yet, but we do have certain reader access areas have hot water decontamination equipment. There are several marinas and boat dealerships that have these hot water decontamination stations. And we've been talking to them about taking on this responsibility if this rule is in place.
Would it be fair to say that if, in fact, we can't sort of sort out the details of this process, at least in this coming summer, that the home rule means that if I own a wake boat on a lake and I'm using it on that lake, that's the only lake I'm going to use it on this summer? Is that the position of ANR? Or do you see that would be the position you would take? Just so we can be clear to users, right?
Lakes, I think that there's still the potential to provide evidence that you've had decontamination if you were to travel between lakes, even if we don't have the entire system up and running. There is still the requirement, if the rule is accepted and in place, if a wake boat were to travel in between lakes, they're still, according to the rule, they're still required to decontaminate. But it may be easier to have.
Sounding awful squishy.
Yeah.
Sorry, but, Senator Bray.
Sure, just to follow on like decontamination piece a little bit, who will enforce, we've talked over the years about boat washes and launches. There seem to be staffed by volunteers and citizens. I'm a little concerned about someone showing up and then a citizen sort of trying to use like police powers to say you can or cannot enter. It feels like could be a fraught encounter between two citizens. So have you thought through how that would work? Who's going to enforce so that we don't have citizens in an awkward spot?
Happy to speak to that. You're identifying something that's clearly something we've thought about for quite a while. There are decontamination stations that are in existence now, and there are AIS rules that are in existence now. There are often, most times, these two come to each other with no police presence, right? It's going to fall to standards of reasonable people when these come to a head. If they fail, then that's when police entities are called upon to respond, and they do. But certainly it's going to fall to reasonable wake boater A and reasonable greeter B come together. This needs to be done. Well, not doing it today, then they get on the phone with a state trooper or a game warden.
Some of the comments today were reciting citing statute and public safety obligations under statute. So I'm just wondering how, with those in mind, I'm sure you have those in mind as you're drafting the rules. And I'm just trying to better understand how you thought through the public safety portion of it in terms of other users out on the water. There's been a lot of discussion about the 500 feet and shorelines, but for other users who are in the water, they could be exposed to much larger waves by virtue of sharing space. So can you say a little bit about how you do the public safety calculation? How you do that, yeah.
Well, we did align with the existing use of public water rules requirement that the boats stay 200 feet from all other users in the wake sport zone.
Did you have studies that demonstrated that 200 feet is sufficient to protect someone like the grandchild in the canoe or the kayak?
That wasn't really something that we heard.
If I might, the petition didn't directly address or propose particular a new distance between users standard. It was focused on the distance from shore, the size of the area, and the depth. So from the get-go, those were the same parameters we were operating under, along with the standing provision of distance for motorboats from other users. And, again, we're operating at a statewide level. We're doing this at a macro level, sort of setting a baseline and not being asked from the get-go to evaluate that distance, as well as looking at the micro level on a water body specific level, what those users' experiences are. And speaking to the issue of needing to evaluate those at a finer level and get, again, that recreational interaction evaluation. It's not something that is particularly effective at that statewide level.
When I read the petition, which is lengthy, I concentrated on the first times I was looking at all the natural resource things related to stirring up lake bottoms, erosion of shores, stuff like that. But on page 13 of the petition, the first thing they list as a concern is unsafe conditions for swimmers and other recreational boaters. So it seems as though they did raise the concern in their petition. So that's,
Sure.
quite sure
I'm
how
not
to
saying they didn't
square those.
raise it. It was the proposed parameter. The proposed regulation on wake boats didn't include requiring, we haven't had a proposed, we should now require that wake boats stay 500 or 1,000 feet from any other user. That was not a proposed parameter.
Okay, but since the nature of the wake is different than potentially for the bigger wakes, a sort of a novel exposure for swimmers, boaters, kayakers. I'm just wondering if that our past experience is not necessarily an adequate protection for those people because it's simply a much bigger wave that they'll encounter.
I may respond to that in maybe a different way there. I believe that the restriction to 30 lakes is going to cover a large portion of some of these concerns. The depth restrictions are going to cover a large portion of these concerns. If you look at a lake, and certainly I'm not going to speak broadly to every body of water. They're nuanced and they're all going to present their own challenges, which I think law enforcement will be sensitive to. Swimming areas, designated swimming areas, camp swimming areas are going to be places of awareness when there is a wake boat on the lake. Now, I don't believe any of this is going to be a blindside. I'm not trying to make light of this, but tsunami type issue. I do feel that there is going to be back and forth with wake boaters and with private citizens, certainly camp owners, swimmers, any other user with regards to awareness and neighborliness. Having these waves on a lake is going to be novel and for some people. And existing on some of these lakes as a wakeboarder is going to be novel. There's certainly going to be challenges. And if I could take the opportunity to speak a little bit about the law enforcement rollout with regards to this challenge, I think we can look across the landscape of law enforcement today and say that they are stretched, but they are willing and capable. And to one of the commenters' words today, I don't think we're relying I'm not in law enforcement any longer, but law enforcement will look to folks for their input and for their concerns, but in a way that seeks to move ahead in solving the problems together, right? We may not be able to identify whether someone is 500 feet or 450 feet right off the bat. Having that awareness and ability to be cognizant of, is this a safety issue or is it just because I'm mad that someone's on my lake? I think all this has to be calculated and slowly rolled out in an educational fashion, both for law enforcement and for individuals who are experiencing wake boats. And education and and what comes with education, voluntary compliance should be looked upon as the way forward, at least for the first year. Hopefully that made sense. It was a little ranty.
Sure, I think it's the novelty, the size of the waves, the fact, just lakes that are mentioned, Caspian, I know having spent many summers there's a group of people that regularly swim across the lake. It's a good long swim. It's part of a ritual for lots of folks. Now you could say, well, why should they have exclusive rights to do that? But their swimming across doesn't prohibit people from doing other things, but 5-foot waves could, 4-foot waves, whatever. Well, I could imagine being, putting some swimmers at risk. I guess I would just say that.
Representative Bongard, but before you go, if I may, we have 2 other items on the agenda. I'm postponing them until next week, so we'll take a couple more questions. And we do have individuals that do need to leave no later than 9 o'clock for committee work, so want to honor that. So Representative Bongard.
A question really for Thea, I think, council is, does the fact the petition didn't specifically ask for a rule with regard to personal safety prohibit the agency from rolling that into the rule?
No, it's my understanding, and unless there is something sort of unique and specific in Title 10, that the authority is under the APA and they don't need to have the trigger of there being a petition. Much like you see rules coming in from agencies because they thought it needed to be updated or because there was a change on a federal level that is not being prompted by the General Assembly saying you need to do rulemaking or a petition saying that rulemaking needs to happen. And the APA does contemplate petitions and members of the public trying to force rulemaking to happen. So that is not unique to the use of public waters rule.
And when considering a rule that would implicate, that could implicate public safety, is there actually, may answer the question another way, different question, is there any sort of requirement that be considered?
Under the APA, there's no requirement that public safety be looked at. You have heard from the witnesses who testified today, reference to 10 VSA section 1421, which makes reference to a policy around the use of waters. That would not be a requirement under the APA that safety would be concerned, but it could speak to the legislative intent side of what the General Assembly intended with respect to regulate the use of public.
Therefore suggesting that under some circumstances, the agency take that up of its own volition as something new was introduced.
And also to, if Lcar is considering objecting on the ground that it is inconsistent with legislative intent, that would be a place in statute to look to for some legislative intent. Remember, in some instances, it's really easy. You've got like session law, recent session law. You've got people who've been on the committee when there was the General Assembly push that prompted the rulemaking. It's much easier there to say, oh, well, this is what the General Assembly's intent was. It's harder when it's a rule that's existed for a while, update to a rule or amendments to it, and the people who maybe were involved in the enactment of the underlying statute, giving the adopting agency the authority to do the rulemaking, are not here to say what their legislative intent was.
Very quick
On a
follow-up.
break.
So originally when we saw this, I said, oh, how do we figure out legislative intent? Because it was initiated by petition, not by the legislature. But so the substitute, the context for us for legislative intent is go read pre-existing statute.
Yeah,
and rule, I suppose, approved rules.
Yeah, but just because a rule has not been objected to in the past, there is language in the APA that says it's not, to be considered substantive, like unlawfulness with respect to the rule. So just because you didn't object on the grounds of legislative intent the last time you saw the rule doesn't mean that you're bound by saying, well, we didn't object before. We have expressed our legislative intent through the lack of objection.
Okay, but on the statutory record is an expression of legislative intent.
Yeah, and the two that Michael and I sort of highlight what Michael and I included in my email twice is in the pre-meeting email, the two sections from Title 10.
Thank you.
Do we need a motion? It's got to be quick.
Yep. One question. So my understanding is that this Vermont rule regarding weight boat regulations is one of the stricter rules, maybe in the country, but I know in reference to at least New Hampshire. Can you tell me if it is or if there's consideration for other states?
Yes, it is the most restrictive at this time.
Thank you.
I believe we definitely looked at precedent in other jurisdictions. I'm trying to recall where that might have been captured. I know we talked specifically about aquatic invasives and other states' approach to that in our APA filing forms. But yes, we've looked at that. There are other states, in particular Wisconsin, where the legislature is contemplating addressing it specifically. Their distances are at this point not going to be as restrictive.
I think we're done. We'll be back here next week. No, there's no motion required for us to delay action.